So ClimaTalk is a youth-led non-profit organization, and we seek to demystify international climate policy, and we will try to amplify young people's voices in the fight against the climate crisis. That is us. We are an international and diverse team of almost 80 young volunteers from all over the place, actually. And we write short and accessible articles, mostly about climate policy. As you can see here, the topics are very diverse, ranging from law and justice to economics, food and agriculture, and biodiversity. And we basically explain all things related to COP and COP26 in particular. That's for the team I'm in. I'm in the COP26 team. But we do also some other stuff. For example, we showcase youth climate project initiatives, as you can see here. But also we have created a map with over 200 environmentally focused university courses all around the world, which we are continuously expanding. But we also publish students' articles, and they're talking about their uni courses that are particularly environmentally friendly. So if you're interested in studying something around sustainable development, you should definitely check out our website. You can find also our past webinars on the events section of our website, or you just go to our YouTube channel, where you will also find the recording of this event today. And last but not least, of course, you should follow us on all our channels from Facebook to YouTube to keep up to date with what we're doing and come to our events. Good. I think now everyone knows who ClimaTalk is, and we know a little bit who's in the room. We can go over to our panelists today, because I think everyone is already excited to meet you. And yeah, I invite now the panelists to present themselves, and I would say let's start with Marina.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, here in the UK at least. Great being with you all. My name is Marina. I work as a sustainability consultant at Sophie's UK, and I'm also the co-chair of the Youth Policy Advisory Council of the Sustainable Ocean Alliance that we are going to talk a little bit more later on. And the relation of my work to the summit is because we try to bring youth voices to the table and promote inclusive solutions for our biggest challenges. And to me, one of the most important things that can happen at COP is approving large financing to ocean protection and including blue carbon in the NDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. Jack, would you like to go on?
Sure, thanks. Okay, so hi, my name is Dr. Jack Dyer. I formed a movement called Blue Economy Future. For more information about that, you can check out me on LinkedIn or my website, www.blueeconomyfuture.org.za. And I've done some podcasts on the blue economy, climate change, and so forth on YouTube. Today, basically, my work basically concentrates around getting youth and others into this blue economy awareness space, helping them to find out what are the research and innovation insights, the ideas, the networking, the opportunities, news, events, and other areas. Basically, this ties into the Virtual Island Summit because I've seen a lot of great work among the ocean youth activists, the financing solutions and other processes, but it's a chance to help reach out to those at the SIDS states and others and help them to actually make a greater impact and access their work. And what I'm hoping to get out of this for COP and the others is I was personally motivated by the fact of hearing about all the different stories out there, such as the suffering of the Chagos Islanders and other plights. And what I'd really like to do is hope that COP26 gives them a chance to, air their voices, air their grievances and their concerns, and make sure that people actually start to take the voices of them and the youth more seriously, so that they have a greater forum. in promoting the blue economy. So thanks, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jack. The topic of COP26 we will definitely take up during today's event. So I'm looking forward to hear more about that. Then Francesco, would you like to present yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Francesco Sindico. I am the co-director and founder of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance at the University of Strathclyde Law School in Glasgow. So we'll have COP26 on our doorstep very soon. At the centre, we focus on many areas of law and policy from an environmental perspective, but we also focus a lot on islands. There's an initiative called Aileen, where we look at legal and political processes to promote sustainability on islands, and in particular, the role of island communities. At SCELG, the center, we've worked not just with academics, but with a very wide range of stakeholders, from civil society, primary schools, to governments, international organizations, industry. And I think this is really what brings us to a forum like Virtual Island Summit, meaning that we bring the academic side, the independent research, the critical view, if you want, to projects that have also other stakeholders and not just other academics. And at the Virtual Island Summit, we really find ourselves in a very important environment, because again, it's not just academic, it's really out there in the so-called real world. And it's not just a pleasure to be there, but we also learn a lot from the Virtual Island Summit. And when it comes to COP26, I'm going to try to be brief, but it is very difficult to comment because it depends what you really mean by success of a conference of the parties. And that can be defined in two ways. If by success in a very narrow way, you consider it as successful negotiations on the very, very little compared to what we had in Paris that has to be negotiated, well, then success will really be the number of conference of the party decisions that may or may not be adopted at the end of the COP. Do these mean anything for islands and oceans? To be honest, not that much, because carbon markets, Article 6, yes, they're relevant for islands, oceans, but it's not the big picture. It's not the big thing for them, I think. Compliance committee, the rules and regulations, again, is it really relevant for islands? Yes, as any other country of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but it doesn't have a strong island focus. If COP success is building a momentum towards not even net zero, but zero emissions or climate positive world, then it's a completely different picture. Obviously, if COP26 is able to drive that momentum, that will be fantastic for islands, island communities, island stakeholders, and the role of the oceans in that will be huge. But the real problem is, how do we define success like that, and what are the parameters to say COP26 has been a success? So I'll leave it to that, and I'm happy to expand further later. Thank you, Leon.
Thank you, Francesco. Yes, I would like to come back to these parameters later. But before that, maybe not everyone knows also about what is the Virtual Island Summit. But we have James here, who's going to introduce himself. And afterwards, he will give you a short presentation about the summit. You will explain why it's particularly interesting that you're giving the presentation. And afterwards, we're happy to receive your questions. So James, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Leonie, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. We just finished a very long week last week. The Virtual Island Summit finished on Sunday. I'm still in recovery mode with all of the team. But the idea of the summit, this is the third year that we've done the event, or the idea of island innovation, I should say in general, is to connect island communities globally to share knowledge and information. So the idea that UK islands like Shetland or the Scilly Isles have something in common with Barbados, Fiji, Mauritius, and Tierra del Fuego in Patagonia, there is an idea there that these islands share certain commonalities when it comes to sustainability. Clearly, there are big differences, but what unites them is are topics like renewable energy, cost of energy, the impacts of climate change, transportation. And so we created the Virtual Island Summit as a forum to share information and unite islanders globally. And climate is one of the big topics in that, but we also go beyond that to talk about island livelihoods and society and culture, and to really give a platform for discussions on the preservation and the development of these communities. So we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And yeah, looking forward to discussing various relevant aspects in COP26 with the panel.
Thank you very much, James. So for everyone who's now in the room listening to our panelists here, you can share your questions in the chat, and we will definitely take them up during the discussion. But maybe I can start with a question. So maybe, James, you want to start, as you were mainly involved, let's say, in the summit. So what were your key, or what would you say were the key takeaways from the summit?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting this year to have, in our second summit during the pandemic. Clearly, many island communities have been hit very hard by this, and this in a way has taken the conversation, has changed the conversation before the pandemic from including around climate, and has maybe taken the focus off the climate conversation. I would say there is still recovery mode for many. As you can imagine, many of these communities are reliant on tourism as a major source of income. And so the economies have often been devastated. And there have also been kind of other unanticipated side effects, such as an influx of, let's say, city dwellers moving and driving up housing prices and issues like that. Also the strain on health services for places that often have a limited or small healthcare facilities. In general, we able to say there were some key actions on key areas that kept coming up. So key themes, things like agriculture and food security. I think both the pandemic and climate change underlined the importance of this, and not just for islands, but many communities, the lack of food security that currently exists. Blue economy and oceans is a repeating theme that keeps coming up, and also energy and obviously the renewable energy transition. So those themes came up throughout the week, and I think there is now, I would say there's some optimism, but also a sense of apprehension looking towards COP in November. And I think a lot of islanders, particularly places like the Pacific Islands that are particularly remote, many have had barely any, if any, passenger flights in the last 18 months, are wondering how are they going to be represented in the discussions in November. And this also applies to many other developing countries as well. And so there is a worry that this crucial COP, after last year being cancelled, is going to be missing some important voices in that conversation.
I think that's a very important point that you're mentioning, James, right now. That probably a lot of voices will be missing at this COP as due to like travel restrictions, and it seems as this is particularly a thing for small islands. So you touched upon a topic of COVID, and I've read that Francesco, you together with Island Innovation have coordinated a global survey on islands and COVID-19. Is there like anything you would like to add from the results from this study?
So we have done two studies. The first one, both with Island Innovation. The first one actually was just at the beginning of the pandemic. So it started last March, April, and it concluded in June 2020. And that was really to gauge the immediate reaction of islands all around the world. There were over 70 islands represented, really a very wide range of reactions. And along the lines of what James was saying, there was the sectors that he mentioned, but the the immediate action was our main focus. So stuff like transport, blocked ferries, airplanes, all that kind of stuff. The second project that I think James just mentioned in the chat is called COVID-19 Island Insights. And this is in collaboration with the University of Prince Edward Island, the Institute of Island Studies there. And there we took a different approach. We worked with 23 islands around the world from all over, all the continents, all the oceans you can think of. And we asked our colleagues on the islands to discuss more the policy recovery packages with an aim to see whether they were moving towards more resilience and sustainability and the extent to which the Sustainable Development Goals were being considered. And to be honest, a bit like what James said, because of the pandemic, the climate and sustainability side has been not as prevalent as it once was, for obvious reasons to some extent. But that does beg the question that if you want to build back and you want to build back better, we cannot just copy and paste the, I wouldn't call them the mistakes, but the characteristics, the unsustainable characteristics that some of the island economies and societies had before. But it's easier said than done. How do you change a tourism-based economy from one day to the other into something very different? Who's going to benefit from it? Who's going to drive it? All those questions are yet to be answered. We do have some things, and you see some countries, islands focusing on the digital nomads, and James has done a lot of work on that as well. Others obviously are looking at some slightly different kind of economic systems. But at the same time, although we all like to say in webinars like this, we want to build back better, we want to build back better, a lot of people will say, no, we just want to build back faster and get back to where we were and start again. So it's a difficult conversation to have.
Talking about building back better and the recovery from the pandemic, Jack, you are involved in the creation of a blue economy. What exactly is a blue economy, and can you tell us more about the work you're doing with it? Oh, we can't hear you. You're still on mute.
Right, yes, thanks. Yes, well, the blue economy is basically looking at our it's a relatively newer found relationship with the ocean. So we're looking at how to ensure a more equitable social ocean that's all inclusive and all embracing to access to resources, to look at how we can develop it economically, more sustainably, and also environmentally and socially. So the blue economy is the ocean economy, but now revived to start thinking about the social, the environmental, the human, and the economic side of things. So I've been involved in this space in a number of different ways, as a consultant, as a lecturer, and helping entrepreneurship, and also as a youth volunteer and activist, helping to spread awareness about what this actually means, helping people to identify what are the jobs, the research, the funding, the ideas as entrepreneurs, or any ways in which they can become active in the different causes. And so that's what led me into the Sustainable Ocean Alliance and the Global Blue New Deal. And currently at the moment, I'm working on with some small islands such as Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, more particularly to help these nations fund and access the blue economy, support marine conservation and other initiatives, and help improve their institutional capacity, because there's a lot of interest out there to actually fund and support and profit from this area while protecting the marine environment.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that COVID also provided like an opportunity for the transition of the islands to a more resilient economy, or to a blue economy?
Yes, it has, because I think what these islands have come to realize, but particularly in the past, many of these islands in the Pacific and Caribbean were particularly dependent on tourism. Now with the COVID-19 recovery, they're having to readjust their tourism diversification strategies. They're realizing how dependent they are on trade and food security. There's also energy security and other things. So they're looking at this chance as a way of reprioritizing their recovery, their economic growth opportunities, and looking for more sustainable, eco-friendlier alternatives, as well as embracing renewable energy. So for some people have seen it, the pandemic, as a risk, others are seeing it more as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And Marina, at the latest, after seeing Seaspiracy, I think a lot of people now acknowledge how important it is to also protect our oceans, which are connected to islands. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on it, why it is so important for the climate and for the oceans to protect, oceans especially?
Sure. Well, first, because the ocean is life, right? When we are talking about, there is so much around it. So not only the food, so a big part of the proteins we consume around the world comes from the oceans. A big part of the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. In the glaciers, we have huge, like normal water, frozen. So when we talk about the ocean ecosystem, it's basically something that helps us stabilize life on Earth. And the big connection with climate is also related, for example, with high emissions of greenhouse gases in general that elevates the temperature and can cause the melting of the glaciers, of course, and poses a threat to islands, but also the acidification of the ocean that damages all the biodiversity and can compromise our food security and also the livelihoods of a lot of coastal communities around the world. So it's all integrated, right? And we need to look this as a framework, and this connects a lot to the blue economy that Jack was just mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Given the questions that we're receiving, there seems to be a lot of people in the audience that feel like motivated to become active, to become involved. And I mean, you are our youth representative here. Maybe you have some tips, like what can young people do to become more involved in the protection of islands and oceans?
Well, there are definitely several ways you can be more active on your daily basis. For example, not consuming single-use plastic that will generate marine litter, or you can be more aware of where do you buy your food and where is it from. You can think about all the carbon emissions, but you can of course also join NGOs like the Sustainable Ocean Alliance, where we help to pressure politicians and create also new frameworks that could be adopted and try to promote this change from different levels of stakeholder engagement, right? So I think you can work from inside companies, you can work to change your own behavior as consumers and as citizens, and you can pressure politicians or become one, or if you are one, make some real change.
Talking about the topic of participation and representation, I want to come back to the Virtual Island Summit. James, there were speakers and attendees from over 100 island communities, including the Arctic, Caribbean, Europe, the Indian Ocean, Pacific Islands, South America, and beyond at the summit. So I was wondering, like, what was the role of knowledge in this kind of summit? So what was the role of knowledge, of local knowledge and of indigenous knowledge?
So we really make an effort for all of the discussions to include representatives of what's known as the quadruple helix. So private sector, public sector, government, research and academia, and the NGO civil society sector. So those four sectors, and as much as possible, get representations from each of those, because what I often find is that knowledge gets siloed into those different sectors, even when each sector may want the same goal, want the same thing, have the same goal. It doesn't mean they know how to talk to each other or how to work together or how to get things done. So we kind of see these silos in a couple of different ways. One is with those different sectors. Another is between islands, often islands that may be adjacent or next door to each other, may not know. We've even had people join in our summit and find out about projects happening down the road from them on the same island. You know, people that they may not know things that are happening very, very locally. So trying to just break down some of those different barriers for exchange. And it's really important that the majority of the voices are the islanders themselves, wherever in the world they may be. So of course, we have, you know, experts from all different walks of life, but the main experts are the people living and working on a daily basis in those communities. And so those are the ones that we want to bring to the forefront of the conversation as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And talking about COPs again, or the relationship between COP and the virtual island summit. Sorry, in the meantime, my questions are shifting here on the left. I was just wondering, Jack, what kind of role will the blue economy play now during the next COP26? And also, where do you see like the relation to the Virtual Island Summit?
Sure, thanks. Well, I think the role of the global blue economy has become increasingly important. In fact, this is perhaps the first COP26 event that I know that's actually looking at the blue economy and, you know, as part of climate ecosystem restoration and solutions and so forth. And it's becoming really important because there's a lot of, as I say, movements out there to improve. There's a movement towards protecting 30% by 2030 of the world's marine oceans and lands. There's the global anti-seabed mining campaign, which SOA are looking at. There's negotiations on stopping fishing fleets going on. And these are all real issues, along with trying to promote access to sustainable finance, maritime decarbonization and other things, and come to some agreement on the high-level seas of oceans control and policies. And these are all areas which lead into the problems that small island states and these nations are actually facing on a day-to-day challenge, whether it's obviously climate change, pollution, adapting to illegal fisheries or so forth. And the fact is that the Virtual Island Summit means that these people have had a chance to, as I say, voice their concerns, their grievances, their historical injustices and whatever, and to perhaps for the first time actually be taken seriously, because a lot of the work in the past has been focused on the land, has been focused on climate change and so forth. But for many of these nations, they depend mainly on the oceans. So the oceans and the marine sector and so on. So for them, it is particularly important, given how vulnerable they are, that they have a chance to adapt and have their voice heard at the summit.
Talking about the past, I was wondering if you see or if there's any differences to COP25 compared to other COPs, given that it was called the Blue COP. I don't know, Marina is nodding.
No, I was just thinking because I went to COP25 in Madrid, and indeed I saw a change from Poland, right, as well, just the effect of the cryosphere report and the pavilions, and way more talk around SDG 14 than before. Countries actually thinking about how to see oceans as solutions, but maybe someone is better suited than me to tell what we can actually expect from this COP in comparison to the previous. I just know Poland to Madrid, I already felt a difference. Now curious to see Glasgow.
I don't know if anyone wants to add on that. Or?
Happy to jump in. I'm sorry to insist, but again, it depends how you interpret a COP and what you think a COP should do or should not do. If it's about the negotiations, the official ones, it's all about, to some extent, completing the Paris rulebook, which is almost finished. So now it's time of action, it's time of implementation. And to be honest, and I'll put it out there, I do wonder what the future of COPs even is. The COPs have shaped the international climate change legal regime. They have done it well or bad, depending on how you see them. The Paris Agreement is here to stay. I've heard so many people saying, oh, we want a new Glasgow Agreement. There's no such thing. Paris Agreement is there to stay. It doesn't have a deadline like Kyoto Protocol. It's there to stay. Again, if you look at the COP presidency strategic priorities, or whatever you want to call them, then it's a different picture. Poland has some, Chile had another, hence the blue COP, or whatever you want to call it. What are the priorities for the UK slash Italy with a little bit of Scotland? It's a mixed bag. It's a bit of everything. They started out with some cool names, and then they focus on mitigation, adaptation, finance, and cooperation, which at the end are the pillars of the climate change regime since when? Since 1992. So I don't really see any big novelty there, to be honest. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that will happen in the corridors, but there we go back to what James said. Usually the COPs, a lot of the deals that are not in COP decisions are struck precisely that, in the corridors, by real people, shaking real hands and not nodding on a screen. This is going to be different. You won't have those people in the corridors. Not everybody will be there. And how do you make those real handshakes into virtual handshakes? The Virtual Island Summit works really well because it was created as a virtual summit. To make a COP virtual when it was thought as an in-person COP is a completely different thing.
Completely. I think it's really important that these, like, I'm really in a way excited about the benefit of virtual conversations like the one we're having today, and the fact, the mainstreaming of that's come out of COVID and the pandemic. I think it's a very small blessing out of a terrible period that we can exchange information like this. Not that we couldn't before, but I remember when we did the first Virtual Island Summit, there's this thing called Zoom, you've got to download it, mute. Like, we're all so literate with this now. But it's a completely different thing to meeting in person. And they both have their places, but I don't see virtual events and physical events as substitutes for each other. When it comes to the negotiations at COP, so much of the negotiations is trust between individuals. And you're just not going to have that on screen. You don't know if you'll be recorded, you don't know who else is watching, you just can't build that same level of personal relationship that negotiations value. For me, I mean, I've been to several COPs now, and to be honest, the negotiations are not part of my COP. And that's interesting, right? This whole thing is built around a negotiation. But for me, as a participant, as a stakeholder in that event, I'm actually not even thinking about the negotiation. So COP has become this monster with so many different things happening. I could get, especially as someone working with islands globally, can meet with partners coming from the Pacific, from the Caribbean, from the Indian Ocean, from all over the world, and have 2 weeks of face-to-face engagement that would have taken months to build up. So there were huge benefits to that. And for me as an individual, that allowed, and the organizations that I represent allowed me to get a lot of things done because I could build those relationships, have meetings. But in a way, that's completely irrelevant to the actual original purpose of the core negotiation. So there is this whole circus of other things happening around. I think those are important in a way because it was a space that was created of getting things done, and there was an atmosphere. And going back to my other point about those players coming, even if the UK government, which it has committed to do, we can argue whether it's going to be successful, but it's committed to make sure that all those delegations are represented. Let's say all the 190 something plus countries that are participating have their legal representations there. The civil societies are not going to be represented equally. But that was the same before COVID. I mean, how many of the last 10 COPs were in Europe? I don't have the exact figure. Maybe someone knows in the chat. But wasn't it like half of them were in Europe? Because even when Fiji was the chair, it was still in Germany, and all of the media events were also in Germany. And so that meant that the civil society representation was totally biased towards wealthy countries that could afford to be there. So it was always kind of skewed, and this is just like COVID has with so many other things, it's just exacerbated those inequalities.
Thank you for taking up this point again. And before we continue the discussion, I would like to invite Marina to do a small input on the Global Blue New Deal, which will bring some more, food for discussion, I think.
Yes, let me just share my screen. Can you see?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Global Blue New Deal that we have been working the Sustainable Ocean Alliance. So to start with, what is actually YPAC, that is the Youth Policy Advisory Council? Well, we are a council composed of 15 young leaders from SOA, and we represent 9 global regions from 15, we are 15 members from 15 countries, and we are each of us experts in specific policy areas, and we work to improve overall ocean health. And in 2021, this year, YPAC has focused mainly in developing this Global Blue New Deal and on campaigns related to seabed mining, a moratorium on seabed mining. These are our members. So Mark is the chair and me, I'm the co-chair. So where does it come from, right? The idea of the Global Blue New Deal comes from the Green New Deal. There was this novel framework to achieve a carbon zero future by 2050 that brings this intersectional mobilization to recognizing the implications for our life of a changing climate, so on human welfare, and mainly for the vulnerable communities. But there is a big blue hole there, that is oceans are only mentioned once in the whole text of the Green New Deal. And this says a lot about where our attention is going to. And in the meantime, also building this momentum, what is the power of youth with movements like the Fridays for Future and global climate strikes, bringing the youth voices to the forefront of the climate crisis conversation around the world. So what is the Blue New Deal? It aims to outline an ocean policy framework that integrates crowdsourced youth priorities that will be proposed to governments on international, national, and local scales for implementation. So it brings the intergenerational climate justice component, a bit on the pandemic recovery in terms of proposed solutions. It tries to connect with the SDGs actions and UN Ocean Decade, and it tries to promote a sustainable blue economy. So we made this Blue New Deal. It started out with a survey that we distributed in 2019 and 2020. We're in total 101 surveys from 38 countries. From that came our first draft that went through a public workshopping with breakout rooms with the pillars that were then synthesized, and we had last month a public comment period that included NGO leaders, UN Decade Ocean affiliates. We had even ministers commenting. So we are very excited now in September to review this public comment, synthesize and redraft our final version. So I'm gonna talk just quickly about what are our 4 pillars. So the first is a low carbon future, which tries to address a little bit of the climate emergency. So the sub-pillars are ending offshore drilling and investing in renewable ocean energy, decarbonizing the shipping and fishing industries, reducing carbon-intensive marine pollution, and promoting a circular economy. The second pillar is to preserve biodiversity, mainly applying nature-based solutions to promote healthy ecosystems and climate resilience. So the sub-pillars are achieving the 30-30 of MPAs, enforcing against no compliance in MPAs, establishing a global deep sea mining moratorium, and transitioning from gray to blue carbon infrastructure. Then we have sustainable seafood, trying to match the increasing demand on global supply, the increasing global demand, with the pillars of encouraging sustainable governance of capture fisheries, enforcing against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, eliminating capacity enhancing fishery subsidies, providing a sustainable path for aquaculture, and funding research and development for plant-based and cell-cultured seafood. So a lot of innovations here. And the fourth and last pillar is related to stakeholder engagement. So to include local communities in natural ocean resource management. And the sub-pillars are the first, ensuring the sustainability of coastal ecotourism, The second, promoting ocean research and innovation. Then improving ocean literacy and capacity building for ocean governance. And the D, building accountability in ocean governance. And in this pillar, of course, we try to encompass a lot of the indigenous knowledge and a lot of vulnerable communities and coastal communities knowledge here. Our timeline, so as I just mentioned, in September, we are gonna synthesize all the public comments and have our finalized version. In October, we are gonna be working also engagement with the Blue New Deal, looking at COP26, that is gonna happen in November. And ongoing, we are always building community and a larger coalition of partners to promote the amplification of the global Blue New Deal. And I would like to invite you all who was asking about how can we actually get involved and take action. You can sign our open letter of the Blue New Deal, calling politicians to recognize the youth priorities in this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marina. And first of all, very impressive work that you and your colleagues have done. Let me start this with a question about, because as far as I understood, this is kind of like a youth-led initiative. So how do you think, how big will be the influence on COP26 this year?
Well, what we are hoping, a bit of a spoiler, but I don't know, we are working on it, is to get this letter and the Global Blue New Deal out to the representatives at COP, so they can at least be aware of our priorities. And we are trying to work on creating some sort of mobilizations also around there to get these priorities recognized the most as possible.
Mm-hmm. And Jack, what do you think, like this, Global Blue New Deal, how does that play into the blue economy? What does it mean for the blue economy?
Well, I think the inspiring thing was that it actually was youth-driven as an entirely voluntary initiative, which didn't involve government to the same degree. It wasn't brought on by NGOs or anybody else, but it's actually a chance for the youth, who, as I say, we are the current generation, to actually be the ones to take principled stands against these measures and to be aware and to be inspired to actually do something. So I think the fact that they are now not only recognizing the global blue economy, but waking up to the realities of this narrative and being prepared to act against some of the main causes, obviously, as we've seen with the seabed mining and other real challenges. So I think it's really inspiring to see how this can develop further into the economy, sort of as a movement from below. I mean, just building on what's already happened with climate change, with those strikes and everything.
Thank you. James, there's a question from the audience to you. They would like to know, like, how do you consider this kind of like fifth sector initiatives, and should they always be representative as well, for example, at the Virtual Island Summit?
I mean, I think it makes sense to be as broad and inclusive as possible with when it comes to this. So I mean, short answer would be yes, I guess, as much as possible. I'm not sure if there's more to that question.
Well, maybe sometimes a simple yes is also just a good answer. Thank you for that.
Go ahead.
Anything to add? No? Okay. There's so many questions from the audience, so I will try to integrate them all. And I even don't know where to start. So there's a more like technical question, maybe with Marina, now that you're an expert on oceans and everything around it. So is it possible that the protection of oceans, so preventing overfishing, for example, could also damage island economies if they economically rely on heavy fishing? That might also be a question for the others. But if you want to start.
Well, I think everything has to be done very carefully. Always when we are talking about shifting economic models, there is always choose sides, right? Like people are dependent, the whole global economy depends, like fishing is a huge industry. And of course, we want to make this as sustainable as possible, as transparent as possible, with the biggest amount of alternatives to that as possible. We always need to take into consideration the impact that it can have, mainly for local communities. But maybe, I don't know, people more, either maybe James can tell a bit more about how this actually impacts the communities of specific islands. But the way I see it is that sometimes the huge fishing industry is already a huge competitor for local communities. So it's a little bit of balance, finding balance there, but I don't know, James.
So the question is how the fishing industry relates to the island economy, or is there something else? Okay, so I think that varies a lot. I mean, it's really interesting to look at the Pacific, where you have a country like Kiribati with a population of 100,000 people, but a sea area greater than the United States. The term small island developing states is often heard, but there's been an increasing movement to use instead large ocean states, and to put the emphasis on the ocean as a resource. And in many of those states, the challenge is that the fishing economy it's just impossible to police it, and so many fleets are coming in, taking those resources, abusing those resources, and okay, the countries are able to sell and to take some profits and some shares in that, but there's a lot of illegal fishing that's happening. That's very different, and I'm not a fisheries expert, probably others can comment, but that's very different than, say, coastal fisheries, which are being used and often being used sustainably by islanders for their own local consumption. We need to differentiate between the fish that is being exported, fished en masse, and consumed elsewhere, with what is being consumed locally. It's interesting that when we're talking about island sustainability, often there's a big gap between people working on oceans and people working on islands. And part of what we've been trying to do is to bridge that gap and have more of that conversation. And I think, unfortunately, that's because you have cultures in the Pacific, and it's a shame we don't have anyone who can kind of comment on this from the Pacific, but cultures in the Pacific that grew up, that emerged, around seafaring and navigating, that have, I guess, through the colonial process, largely lost those traditional skills and lost much of that relationship with the ocean. In somewhere like the Caribbean, where much of the culture comes from a legacy of slavery, again, there was that kind of, the process of colonialism took away that relationship with the ocean. And so you have a situation where in many islanders around the world, people don't have a strong relationship with the ocean. They may not be able to swim. They may not appreciate that and see that as a resource. There's an amazing activist in Montserrat, which is a really small island in the Eastern Caribbean, called Vita Wade. I'll share her Instagram in the profile, who has done some really amazing work on rebuilding Caribbean people's connection with the ocean and seeing that importance. And I think, I think people like her that are helping to make those connections are doing a really important job.
Talking about this reconnecting of systems, Jack, there's a question that I think directs towards you. So a blue economy doesn't need to be only for islands. Is it more of a general change? You're muted.
Hi, yes. No, I don't think it is only just about islands, because I mean, we're all in some ways dependent upon it. I mean, so far there's over 30, 40 countries that have signed up to protecting over 30% of the blue economy, the marine protected areas and oceans and so forth. And many of them are from, that are not necessarily direct island states. A lot of them are across Europe, Canada, parts of South America and so forth. So I think this whole narrative is actually growing to incorporate a whole number of different stakeholders who are in fact realizing just, if anything, how dependent we are on the ocean. I mean, we only had to look at the 6 days in which the, if a given container ship blocked the Suez Canal to just realize how dependent we are on the ocean for that entire week or so, and then with the pandemic and everything else. So no, I think it's actually broadening to include a whole lot more people.
Talking about including people, there's also a question about engaging communities in policy, for example. So what would you say, how does that look in practice? I don't know if you want to start, Jack, otherwise James, maybe that might be for you.
No, happy to let James speak on this one.
Okay.
I don't know if I have much to add on that we haven't said already, to be honest.
Okay, well then maybe let's come to the end, because we have only 4 minutes left, and there's a question I really would like to ask you as like the last question, so you can elaborate on that. So technologies will no doubt be able to ameliorate certain environmental issues, but without the world coming together as one worldwide consensus, how will we be able to have a reliable roadmap for our future? That's a very broad question, but I think it's directed towards, of course, island and ocean issues. Maybe for a last final statement of each of you. Who would like to start?
Sure, yeah, I think it's a very, very broad question, and we've had like a very disruptive 2 years. I think there was a lot of hope that the disruption could bring out a change and kind of a new way of looking at things. I don't know to the extent that is true necessarily. I think obviously COP is important and that these negotiations are important, but there's far more important things happening on the ground in many places that people are doing. So I was really happy to see Joshua here from Micronesia sharing in the chat his perspective. And again, I would rather have, when talking about the Pacific, I'd rather have someone like him talking about the Pacific from his own Pacific Islander perspective, but unfortunately he couldn't jump on the mic. I've just shared in the chat as well some information about our work, Island Innovations plans for COP26. I think, and sorry to keep bringing it back to the COP, but I guess that is kind of that's kind of the milestone we're all looking at right now. I really do think the accessibility and inclusivity is something that is going to be helpful moving forward, being able to access more information and make these connections. And so what we want to do is try and create really a hybrid space to share everything happening in Glasgow in November with island communities around the world and make that more accessible for those that perhaps can't be there, the majority of people who can't be there in person. So that page is going to be updated with some more information very soon, and do check that out. And we also have just launched an Island Awards program. I'll share some information about that because I think it's really important to showcase projects and showcase people working on all these issues that we've discussed today. So just a little plug at the end to encourage people listening to check those out. Thank you so much for having me. Really good conversation.
Thank you, James. Maybe Jack, would you like to say some words about like how can we create a reliable roadmap for the future?
Sure. I mean, I think in some ways, obviously the different stakeholders, I mean, obviously there's different forums at the COP26, and obviously the youth such as Marina are trying to do a great job with the youth in the Global New Deal. This challenge of coordination is a really interesting one because I'm seeing there's a lot of synergy going on, and I've seen that there's a lot of private sector initiatives going on, a lot of NGOs, a lot of people acting, and it goes back to James' point about the silo. So while I can't necessarily speak for others, that's what I've come to see is that yes, a lot of people are acting in silos, and part of what I'm doing, well, on a more micro scale, again, putting a plug in for myself at Blue Economy Future, is to try and connect the dots. So obviously, you've got to try and connect the funders, you've got to try and connect the entrepreneurs, you've got to try and create the youth and the different organizations and the politicians and the different, the World Ocean Councils doing the private sector and the UN and everybody else. So I think there's a lot of people who are working in their space and to try and coordinate everything. And there's a lot of great solutions and ideas. But I think the whole coordination thing is, as you say, it's a great challenge, which I myself am trying in my small way to help work against. And hopefully through, obviously, climate talks, the Global Blue New Deal and others, it's really the main challenge that we're going to have to look at. How can we coordinate? But I don't think that necessarily detracts from the whole technology side of things, because it's, given how great the scope of the problem is, I think it's really great to actually get enough people actually coming up with the ideas and the technologies and the solutions. And let's face it, there's a lot of things that we can all be doing to make a difference. So even if it's not all coordinated, I think it's inspiring that they're actually doing it. And I think that we should be encouraging them to try and actually get on with it and try and get involved, rather than just say that without coordination, it's going to not work. So I don't know. It's a great problem, coordination, but I take hope from the entrepreneurs and the technology that's out there as one of the best ways to solve our problems.
Marina, you've done great work in coordinating efforts, and you have actually designed a roadmap for the future. So what is now missing to implement it?
Well, I think I would say now what is missing is the second part of the coordination, right? Because we managed to coordinate experts and youth, but now need to bridge this with the other stakeholders as well. We need private sector to also make some changes, and we need politicians to actually adopt this framework and start to put the policies out to move us towards this roadmap, because a lot can be said, but right now we haven't really seen any action, at least in terms of very big, large scale changes. Of course, technology can go really fast and can have great transformations, but the scale of the challenge we have, I think we can just use all help we can get, and action is definitely needed. And although youth mobilize and we are all super engaged, also all the civil society, because we are trying to protect our world, we also need these efforts to come from other sides, and the coordination is really a challenge. But if there is one time that we need to make it work, it's now.
That's a very strong message and a good closing statement. Thank you very much, Marina.
Thank you
and I
all.
saw that Jack already had to leave, and Francesca also had to leave us a little bit earlier. But yeah, I want to thank you a lot for being here today and discussing with us and with the audience through my voice. I wish you good luck for all of your efforts that you're doing. It's an amazing work, and I'm very impressed. And I hope that our audience is also inspired to inform themselves more about all the topics around oceans and islands. And I think our speakers have also shared some contact information if you want to get in touch. So yeah, thank you very much to all of you out there for listening and discussing with us. We're looking forward to receive you on our next event as well. That will be probably youth voices from the pre-COP youth event in Italy. Sorry, I forgot the name. But more information about that later. You can always be up to date through our social media channels. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.